Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am both halves of your co-hosting duo this week, as Sean is out again, but fear not, he will be back next week. And if you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, welcome home, because every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, like Trump's prior business ventures, his takeover of the GOP transformed the party from a buttoned-up, disciplined group focused on a cautious approach to change and traditional values to a sometimes raucous, populist party with all the sizzle of a Trump steak. Now, some in Washington welcomed the change, while others tried to preserve the remnants of the old party and soon found themselves out of a job. But while the media often casts the GOP as an ideological red hat wearing monolith, many still look to bring it back to its traditional roots. And this week, I had the chance to sit down with Josh Lewis, someone who has been trying to do that since 2016 via his blog and podcast, Saving Elephants. Josh was actually the last guest on my last podcast 2 years ago, and I wanted to get his take on the current state of the Republican Party and whether traditional conservatism has a political home in 2025. This one is a little longer than the traditional episode, but I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. And without further ado, here's Josh. We'll start things off here. I know who you are, Josh. I know what you do. You were my last guest on my last podcast. I would just like to tell the listener, not his fault at all. He did not kill the podcast. But could you just tell the listener who you are and what Saving Elephants is all about?
Yeah, Dan, I appreciate you clearing that up for me, because I honestly had wondered when I went back and watched it. What was that, 2-3 years ago? We did a podcast. Great conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope the audience did. But then it was like, wow, he ended the podcast right after the episode we produced. And so I definitely appreciate the vote of confidence you have in me back. Saving Elephants, as you had asked, is primarily but not exclusively a podcast. I also have YouTube, I have a blog, I have a newsletter, I'm dabbling in 2 or 3 other things. But mostly it's a podcast, and it's a podcast, as the name implies, about trying to save the Republican Party. Its handle is Millennials, which I consider myself to be I guess you would call me an elder or geriatric millennial. I'm on the old end of it. Okay. But I identify with the millennial generation that because of the era we grew up in, we didn't necessarily have access to true conservative government in the sense that would be ideal, say in the United States. So trying to reach my generation with, hey, here's what actual classical conservatism looks like. It's not what's on display today, but here's what it would look like. And the best vehicle currently, unfortunately, for conservative agendas to be enacted is a Republican Party, or at least historically it has been. And so the idea of saving the elephant is trying to rescue it or call it back or reform it to a conservative message. It did in 2016-17 start with almost a more, or rather a broader sense of, I was concerned the direction MAGA and Trump was going would literally doom the Republican Party. And so it had a dual meaning, both trying to pull it towards conservatism, but also save it from just complete oblivion. I failed to take into account the degree to which the Democrats would also go insane in that time, and both parties would kind of mirror each other in their, here, hold my beer, watch me go. And so I was obviously wrong about the prospects of Trump moving in a populist cult of personality doom the party. It clearly didn't. But I still think that larger project of trying to call it back to a more conservative center is present, very necessary today.
So you were the treasurer for the Tulsa Republican Party, and you stepped down in 2016, and that was because of Trump, correct?
It was, and there are certain individuals who are not happy with my brand of Republican or conservatism, say, who will often point out that that's a relatively lowly and not paid position. Hey, I fully acknowledge that. The only reason I mention it isn't to try to give some sort of credence as to, hey, look how important I was. It's not that at all. It was a lowly position. It's more, I want individuals to understand I was part of the mechanism within the party. I was loyal to it. I worked within it. I wasn't just someone who only voted for Republicans on election day. I was someone who wanted the party as a whole to succeed, even if I recognize there are elements of the party I didn't like, because as a whole, it's what was going to advance, broadly speaking, I think, the agenda that I would want implemented in the United States. And so you're right. In 2016, there wasn't a day or a moment. I mean, you may recall, it was such a bizarre history of the last many years. 2016, 2017. I mean, Ted Cruz at the Republican National Convention says, vote your conscience up and down the ballot, very clearly not mentioning Donald Trump. Lindsey Graham was very willing to say, stand up against Trump. There were lots of Republicans who I don't necessarily even then would have supported, say, who kind of charted this middle course of, okay, this is our leader, I understand, but we're going to hold his feet to the fire. And so it was a very different era, but even then, it just seems so unconscionable that our party would be represented by this individual. And I'm not trying to get too far off here. I want to be very careful. Not everything in my mind is funneled through Trump. I hope I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I think he is more a symptom than a disease, but he's easy to point to and say, that's what I'm talking about. So I don't hate him in all things. If he says 2 + 2 is 4, I'm not going to say, no, it's a hand grenade or something to that effect. He does some things right, some things wrong. But it's the idea that throughout the 90s, we were proud as Republicans that we were the party of character when it counted. And it just seemed like there were so many, from both a moral standpoint and a philosophical standpoint and a political standpoint, that it turned out a lot of people really didn't mean what they said they had always meant. And I could not in good faith countenance that. And so I said, the only thing I can do is just step out of the party. I'm still a Republican, and I still hope to help the party, but I hope to help it by... My hope would be enough people did what I did that it would no longer be a viable party until they chose to go a different direction.
Yeah, I think I told you when we spoke last, the first time I ever voted Democrat in a presidential election was 2016. So yeah. I had voted Republican pretty much every presidential election. I skipped out on 2012. I voted Libertarian that time around, and 2004 I didn't vote because I lived in Massachusetts and John Kerry was running, so it really didn't matter all that much anyway. But 2016, I had such a visceral reaction to Trump. I just found him to be such an unacceptable candidate that I voted Democrat almost out of opposition. And I'm curious for you, what was it about Trump that was so objectionable to you?
Yeah, and I should probably just put my cards on the table. Yeah. Well, two things. First of all, I do not fault people who voted for Trump or Hillary or didn't vote or a third party in 2016 or same 2020. These are difficult elections. We have not had an angel and demon on the ballot, as far as I'm concerned. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. Here in Oklahoma, I didn't vote for the Libertarian because that was literally my three choices. We can't write in anybody in the ballot. I probably would have wrote in Mitch Daniels or someone else. It's a combination of things. I think the very first thing was he was an individual who clearly wanted to or did not mind doing harm to the Republican Party. He represented to me a hard break from, ironically, kind of the old establishment that I was also railing against, but a break almost more in a French revolutionary Jacobin sense. What's most important is just that we burn the house to the ground and then let's figure it out. And that's the polar opposite of conservatism, by the way. It doesn't mean you have to countenance bad things or you can't say this needs to change, but it does mean you need some sort of compared to what? What is the plan? What is the long-term goal here before you just start? It's the guy who finds a job before he quits the one he has, rather than one just sort of hopes things will go well. He had this sort of sense of attacking others within the party, but attacking them in such a degree that it betrayed the fact he did not either comprehend or care to comprehend the complexities of what had come before him, either from international standpoints or trade policy or economics. He had relatively bumper sticker populist phrases. To pick a single example, his notion that we could somehow save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security by identifying waste, fraud, and abuse and getting that out of the system. I'm an auditor, and that is so bizarrely absurd. It's sort of like saying if Walmart's about to go bankrupt, let's find all the cashiers skimming cash out of the registers. Sure, I'm all about finding that, but the idea you're going to save a system that is billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, just because you've identified some fraud is absurd, and it's not a serious proposal. And I think it was that kind of, this is not a serious individual, but he also has the capacity to be a demagogue. He literally said at the first convention, "I alone can fix this," to thunderous applause. And I think it believes it. Now, I will admit that I think he was less Mussolini than I at first thought he might be. I think if we were Italy circa 1920s, he probably would be a Mussolini, but we have too many strictures and historical safeguards in place that it would just take too much time and energy and his focus to truly be dictatorial, if you will. But it was the first in my lifetime, I remember, an individual who claimed to hold the Republican and conservative mantle who clearly did not seem to want to work within the clear guidance of the Constitution. And to me, that was very scary. And the number one thing I was most concerned about was his tendency to kind of say things that would skirt around constitutional limitations, because I think that's incredibly dangerous. And I think that was borne out by election night 2020, all the way till January the 6th, where he consistently tried to rail against the results of the election. By the way, in 2016, when he ran against Hillary Clinton, he literally told the moderator, "I will keep you in suspense. I am not going to say tonight that if I lose this election, I'm just going to concede the results. I'll keep you in suspense." And he again cited a lot of fraud. And so I think an individual who is willing to work against the system of the peaceful transfer of power. Granted, he only went so far. He didn't actually call in troops, or he possibly could have gone further. But who clearly seeks to undermine our confidence in that system as someone who is dangerous far beyond themselves. It could have repercussions for generations to come when the next guy tries it, and God help us, might actually succeed.
Yeah, my reasoning behind voting Democratic, especially in the 2024 election, was my hope was Trump's defeat would finally wash him from the Republican Party.
Right.
And then the Republican Party could go back to reforming. That didn't happen. And so now my hope is that the Democrats collapse. I think one thing I want to drill down on before we get any further is what you view conservatism as. That's the subject of your blog. That's the subject of your podcast. Like, what is conservatism? What would you view as core conservative principles?
I think you asked me this last time I was on your previous podcast, and it is a multi-hour answer to give it any justice, but I'm obviously going to summarize this. I think first and foremost, it begins with sentiments that we ought to be grateful for the good things we have. And I don't just mean in our personal lives, but as Americans, to look around us and recognize that life is not perfect, things can fall apart, and therefore our orientation is how do we maintain good things first. As I mentioned earlier, the exact opposite of conservatism is radicalism. They're both contextual based. A conservative wants to conserve, a radical wants to tear apart. So the radical tends to see what's wrong with the system. And we hear this often. It grafts on, but not perfectly, to sort of a populist narrative of the elites that are in charge of doing things wrong. Put me in power and I will fix it. And we see this on the left too. Bernie Sanders often has a sort of notion of, here are the ways in which Western democracies are succeeding that we're not. Why can't we just do what they do? And he gets a little fuzzy when you try to get him pinned down to answering questions. What are the reasons they're different? How would we afford that? What is your actual plan? Things of that nature. And so I think it starts first with a recognition that chaos is almost inevitable. It is lurking at the door. Conservatives tend to be happily surprised when things go well, where I've noticed my left counterparts are often angry when things are not going as well as they perceive they ought to. Sort of a notion that, well, somebody out there must be doing something unjust, so let's alter the system in order to institute some form of justice, even if we can't identify who that is. Whereas a conservative is far more likely to countenance discomfort out of a concern that things could get worse if we just ignore, well, why did they get to be this way? To be super clear, that does not mean a conservative is against reform or change. It just means that the default position is to first understand, how did we get here? What would we compare this to? How would things get better? And to try to work in slow incremental manners so that we don't make something worse in the process. All that being said, I think Roger Scruton, the philosopher, probably has the most succinct way of saying it, which is that the conservative begins with the notion that the good things we have in life are easily destroyed but not created, and so they're oriented towards protecting them. Russell Kirk talked about conservatism being a sentiment chiefly, not just that, but that it begins with a feeling. It doesn't begin with a programmatic, like liberalism or socialism. Here is how we ought to structure society. It actually begins with a notion of, you know what, maybe we don't know how we ought to structure society. Maybe the best we can hope for is to look to our past and try to gain wisdom from those who have gone before us and the things that have been tried, because we can't actually produce a perfect political system, but we can sort of notice, okay, when we tried this way, it seemed to work, and this doesn't seem to work. So we're kind of all in this together as a generation of those living dead or those yet to be born.
I think generally the slow incremental change is the thing that I've picked up on the most about traditional conservatism. You know, jumping back a little bit too, you had mentioned it sounds like there's a point where you saw the party going off course. When do you feel the Republican Party really embodied those conservative principles, and why?
There was never a perfect moment, and I think that there's one of these things that recognizing the Republican Party has departed so much from conservative principles, I think has helped, at least for me, see more clearly, okay, these more populist elements, not all populism is wrong, by the way, but these more populist, nationalist, cult of personality elements have always existed in the Republican Party and to a certain degree on the left in the Democratic Party. That being said, if we just look at American conservative movement, which is remarkably new, by the way, it sort of shows up in the late 40s, mid 50s. You kind of think of this thing as you start with Aristotle or Socrates, and now we get on down, we go through Burke and then we're here. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things, I love what Burke and the founders had to say. So there's certainly things that inform us. But the William F. Buckley conservative movement that in a sense began as a counterpoint to the FDR New Deal and especially the LBJ's Great Society. Kind of this notion that we have got politics figured out. It's a political science, right? This is no longer something about negotiating sort of in good faith in the dark. It's actually we can empower experts to get the right answer to progress society. That was something that the conservative movement stood against fiercely. And part of the reason we can't really trace conservatism as a movement prior to that is because prior to FDR, there was no Great Society or New Deal for the conservative to rail against. I don't mean the world was perfect. I just meant there wasn't this continuous push towards bureaucratic entrenchments in our lives. And I realize I'm getting a little off, but the reason I'm starting there is because pushing on through the 1950s, from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, conservatism was honestly in the wilderness. There were, you had your senators, Robert Taft and your Barry Goldwaters, but they're almost more anomalies. They were almost more like hardcore socialists in the United States Congress today. Yeah, they're there, but they're not in charge. And they were always pushing, hoping that they could gain some sort of leverage or power. It really doesn't come about until the 1980s under Reagan. And even then, the House and the Senate were predominantly controlled by Democrats. So there was an era throughout the 80s, through the 90s, where Republicans had a contract with America. Newt Gingrich, you could argue there were some conservative principles there. But it sort of died out around that era. It returned to kind of a big government, if you will, compassionate conservatism, Republican establishment. That being said, there are elements of conservatism throughout all of this. So it's a messy answer. I wished I could say here is the year, but it's more there were elements in which conservatism came to the fore, and now they're kind of in the background.
Yeah, and this is something we're going to get to a little bit later too, which is how do you put these principles into practice? But just to build on something you were saying there, I kind of share your belief that the modern conservative movement really rose out of the New Deal, sort of as an opposition to FDR's expansion of the federal government. And oddly enough, especially when you take in the context of this conversation thus far, I feel like Trump's second term is almost doing that in reverse now. But I think there's an added danger to what's going on, because I think one of the things conservatives have said throughout, or have had, I should say, is this suspicion of concentrated power.
Yeah.
And that is embodied in their suspicion of the federal government, in their suspicion of growing the size of the federal government. And we're almost witnessing the peril of that now. Because the reason you don't want to centralize power in Washington is because you might get somebody like Trump. You can get somebody who is very much motivated by self-interest and has no respect for the institutions. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot on this podcast as well is how you've also noticed this gradual secession of power from Congress to the executive branch over the last 20 years. So now we really have what the founders feared, which is this very powerful, very large federal government. And effectively, I mean, at least no check on the president from Congress. I think it remains to be seen whether the Supreme Court will stand in their way. But effectively, what we have is the type of strong executive that this system was supposedly built to prevent. I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Yeah,
If you just want me to keep going.
that's really interesting. You're saying we almost have it in reverse, and I think you're right. Now, I think sometimes it might be helpful because while I agree with everything you say, you can narrate in your mind a version of this in which it's not so much the problem that Trump represents an individual of extreme self-interest. I think that he does. I also think he believes a lot of the crap he says. I think he actually genuinely thinks he's doing the right thing. And, and there's I can't remember who said it, but the most fearsome tyrants are not the ones who are just self-motivated. They're the ones trying to do things for your good, because they're morally superior. Therefore, it doesn't matter how many we have to kill off because it's for good, And I'm not talking about Trump in this sense. I just mean if you think of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, I think that's what made them truly hells on earth, is they were doing these things, for the good of mankind. That being said, I think that part of the danger represented here is not so much you get a demagogue in charge chiefly for self-interest, but that you get a demagogue in charge who perceives themselves as speaking on behalf of the right people, of the common person, of the individuals who count, and therefore they're fighting against the wrong person, which can be defined a lot of ways, which, granted, a lot of the people that the Trump administration is fighting against, certain illegal immigrants of questionable or criminal pasts, the wokest mob, the elite cabal in the EU. Traditional conservatives such as myself have long had animosities toward these individuals, but we've also recognized that what was chiefly important was not just to stop them, but was to overpower them with the soundness of arguments within the institutions we have. For that exact reason, because who's to say that Bernie Sanders won't be the next president? I mean, at this point, I don't know if we're going to elect anybody under 70 for who knows how long. Who's to say that the next strong man won't have very different views about who the right people and the wrong people are? And that's the original American experiment is, well, how do you put, at the time they didn't know this, but we got 330 to 350 million of us running around. We have liberty. We all have our own opinions. They're not going to agree. We have to have a structure in which we can facilitate disagreement. We can tolerate individuals living differently. And we can do so in a manner of saying, you know what, the blue state dude in Massachusetts is just as much an American as the red state guy here in Oklahoma. And maybe his views are something I don't countenance or don't think are right. But my desire is not to live in a system that forces blue states to behave in a certain way. It's rather to find a way for us to coexist, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. And I think and first off, I appreciate the fact that you checked my perception of Trump, because it's very obvious for anyone who's listened to this podcast, I'm not a fan. That out of the way, as somebody who's not a fan of Trump, I generally assume there is some nefarious motive behind every policy out there. And so I'm glad you checked me on that part, because we could very well take the position that he is doing some stuff, at least for the good of America.
And by the way, it's entirely possible there is nothing but nefarious motives. Yeah. My only point is, if what we're trying to do is persuade our fellow citizens that this is not their correct way to go, we want to be able to meet them where they are. And it may be too much of a lift to try to say, hey, that guy you love is a totalitarian dictator in disguise. Maybe there's other ways to get there.
That's, I will tell you, the tough part about Trump as a figure is the fact that his language and his method of politicking is, as you said, to define the people who matter and the people who don't matter, or the in-group and the out-group. And he forces you to make a decision. Which one are you?
Yeah.
There isn't a lot of room for people in between. And I think what that does is it creates an environment where you have a lot of folks who believe Trump can do no wrong. And then you have a lot of folks who feel he can do no right.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm blaming Trump for how people think about Trump, but I do think there's something specific to how he speaks. Whereas if you look at past folks on either side of the aisle, for the most part, they're trying to speak for the whole of the country, for the most part. Is there anyone right now you see in the Republican Party that you feel still represents conservative ideals, or do you feel the party's just veered too far off course now?
Yeah, you had shared with me that was possibly one of the
And if
topics
you
you
want
wanted
to
to get
pass,
us.
you can pass,
No, no,
man. That's cool. Yeah.
I think the short answer is no. And I'm not trying to be glib. And look, I recognize there are other Republicans such as myself who don't hold power or sway. So I'm not trying to just say whole cloth. There's no one that in any way represents anything good or redeemable. I do think we can and ought to make discernments between levels of obnoxiousness
Yeah.
or any other level. And look, I'll say this as a lifelong Republican, I have long recognized there are Democrats that are a lot closer to me than others. Some in terms of their character, even if I radically disagree with their ideas, some in terms of their ideas, even if I think they have fairly low character. There's a lot of ways in which I think Bill Clinton was relatively moderate, even if he was a sexual perverted, a predator,
Yeah.
who I wouldn't trust further than I could throw him. So I do think there's a sense in which we ought to be able to distinguish between, and if it would be of any help, I'll just name names. Your Congresswoman Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah.
Now, granted, kind of an oddity there is sometimes I even have more respect for them because they're playing a part that I think they may sort of believe, rather than just claiming things that they clearly don't believe. That being said, I think the problem with them so much is not so much what they believe or how they behave. It's that they're playing the role of politics as entertainment. They're really good at that. That their role why am I blanking on the dude from Florida that they tried to appoint as Attorney General?
Oh, Matt Gaetz.
Thank you. I don't know
Yeah.
why had a different name in mind. Matt Gaetz. He even said one time that his job was to essentially be on TV, and Trump sort of said this in his argument, his infamous battle with Zelensky and JD Vance. That this made for good TV. What the hell does that have to do with how our lives are going to be any better? It's super entertaining, but that's about it. And so I think those are individuals who have recognized that where you have power now in Washington is your ability to get clips and clicks out there, and that gives you a form of power. But where you direct that power to is apparently completely meaningless. It's just about retaining that kind of power. I think there are others who are far more serious individuals: Mitch McConnell, John Thune, Dan Crenshaw. I don't agree with them in all things, and I would even recognize McConnell to me is the most complex figure because I think he's equal parts evil and exactly the sort of cerebral seriousness that we need to get back to. He's extremely pragmatic, extremely intelligent, and I know he's kind of on his way out, but I think he recognizes an individual who knows how to work the system in a way and has some sort of principles, even though I might disagree with a good number of them. I think he at least wants to protect the Republican Party. The reason I say no initially to your question is because there were individuals. Senator Ben Sasse, I think, is the closest that comes to someone who represent my view. He left Congress, and I don't know exactly why or to what degree this happened, because as you may know, he became the president of the Florida University.
Yeah.
And he since left that job because his wife is in poor health. So to what degree that might have had something to do with him leaving the Senate in the first place, I don't know. But he was one of the few individuals that did not, with some exceptions, did not seem to buckle to MAGA views. There are others who are no longer in the Senate: Mitt Romney, Adam Kinzinger, who I Liz Cheney, I think, maybe the most famous example.
Yeah.
I genuinely appreciate what they did. I question sometimes whether or not it was as effective as they were hoping, and the degree to which they would align themselves sometimes with the other side in an effort to try to dethrone the direction the Republican Party is going. Hats off to them. It was a courageous move. I don't necessarily join them. I think if this makes any sense at all, I tend to align more with the Dispatch and the Remnant than the Bulwark anti-Trump groups, if you will.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think also it's kind of a loaded question because even in a 5-party, 6-party system, you're still going to have differences in ideology, or you're still going to have inter-party disagreements. I'll ask this question because you mentioned Liz Cheney. So you have a bunch of exiled Republicans out there, exiled elephants, if you will, right? And a few of them have gone in different directions. So, for example, former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman was involved with the Forward Party. Former Florida GOP rep David Jolly For a bit, same thing. Now he's actually floating the idea of running for governor in the state as a Democrat. And Liz Cheney came out and said that a third major party might be needed to provide a home for conservatives. What's your take on that idea?
Big if true, I guess.
Yeah.
Or would it happen? Look, I am, again, there are a lot of individuals that I applaud their efforts while I maintain a sense of doubt about their ability. So, for example, the Forward Party, which I cannot get out of my head that, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but that clip from The Simpsons where the candidates, I believe in forward, not backwards, upwards, not downwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think one of the fundamental flaws oftentimes with many of these groups, not just the Forward Party, but to use them as an example, is they seem to rally around a notion that most sensible Americans on the moderate left or right agree with, which is, hey, what we got now, that's not good.
Yeah.
Let's cool the temperature down. Let's look for individuals that, even if I don't agree with them in all things, I at least can trust them. But you have to be able to rally around not just opposition to something. You have to have some sort of a central cohesive worldview or vision that sort of provides your group, your party, with a direction, a vision of going forward. That has come about traditionally through the two parties. I mean, we have hundreds of years of history between the two, and granted, they change from time to time. And they do also seem to come about from central figures. What it means to be a Trump Republican is very different than a Reagan Republican or a Warren G. Harding Republican, if you will. It's hard to kind of rally around a general idea of let's not have this. And I think that's kind of, there are other organizations, again, they're doing God's work. The Independent Center, I've had some of them guest on my own program. They've done a lot of research and determined that, independence as a class is on a rise. It seems to be somewhat generational, not entirely, but younger Americans such as myself are far less likely to align with either party. I think the problem with that view is that doesn't therefore necessarily mean that those who are no longer within a party happen to agree on the direction we need to be going next. Maybe we all agree we need to go forward. I'm pointing that way and you're pointing that way, and we're both arguing, is that forward or is this forward?
Yeah. I think what's disappointed me about these nascent third party movements is they're building on antipathy of the two party system,
Mm-hmm.
which is very present. But to your point, there's not a direction, there's not a unified direction they're going in. And there seems to be this premise that everybody sort of thinks the same thing about everything, which is not correct at all. And I mean, my personal belief, and I'd love your take on this, my personal belief is that at this point in time, there's a couple things going on. Number one, the two-party system is and always has been an exceptionally clumsy mechanism for communicating voter preference. It is really difficult for a party to be ideologically homogenous. And the era of ideological homogeneity in parties is relatively new. So back in the 60s, there was so little difference between the two major parties that political scientists actually worried that voters would go out and vote for radical parties to get some, yeah, policy.
That is the most insane thing to think.
They got their wish, right?
Yeah.
They're different. Be careful what you wish for there. And so I think there's that, right? I think that's part of it. And I think that allowing more fluidity between coalitions would really help the country a lot. I think part two, and this is to build on something you said earlier about politics as entertainment. I think the toothpaste is out of the tube with that one. I think we are in an era where people are mobilized by media, not by institutions. People want authenticity. They want a connection with an individual, and they will value that over any official institution, whether that be a party, whether that be a government agency, whether that be a university. And you see this with people trusting RFK Jr. over vaccines, over the National Institute of Health, or people trusting Joe Rogan, or people's connection with Donald Trump. They're giving them that one-to-one connection. And I don't know whether that's symptomatic of a system that maybe has failed people. I don't know whether that's just human psychology, but the way people are mobilized politically has changed. And I don't think the current system is built to withstand that. And so I think there are changes that are needed. The whole goal of this podcast is to get people to really start to understand how reforms to the way we elect people to office can change things.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a very, very long windup to the question I was going to ask, which is there are a lot of reforms bubbling up now, such as ranked choice voting, top four voting. Oddly enough, these are systems that have largely favored a certain type of Republican, a Republican that is more likely to buck Trump. So, for example, Susan Collins of Maine, elected under ranked choice voting. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, elected under a top four open primary system. David Valadao, California, open primary system as well. I'm curious as to, do you have any thoughts on those reforms?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
great.
You probably know this point. I'm the kind of guy that has thoughts on everything, whether or not they're cogent or helpful.
Yeah, there's a loaded question right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, much like kind of these third-party efforts, I am cautiously supportive. And if I had my druthers, and I know this might sound a little contradictory, but if I had my druthers, I would want to see us have a concerted national effort to do two things simultaneously. I want a two-pronged approach to get out of this mess. One is to try to strengthen the two parties we have now so that they are unlikely to produce a Donald Trump or a Bernie Sanders. I don't mean Sanders is a terrible person or even Trump's a terrible person. What I mean is they represent individuals who clearly stood against what the party was for and did sort of a hostile takeover, even though Sanders was unsuccessful and Trump was successful. I think a stronger party that has a better control over who represents us, not just at the presidential level, but at all levels, has a better incentive to look at the long term to protect the party, which naturally causes them to want to look at broader coalitions in the middle of the country rather than just the loudest, most extreme factions within their rank and file. I think that's on one side. I want both parties to get stronger. I simultaneously am more than happy to give all sorts of experiments out there as to other ways we can reform things through a third party, through ranked choice voting. There's a number of ideas. The only thing I would caution there is, and again, speaking as a conservative, I would want to see this done on a test basis in a couple of states slowly over time, because I simply do not know what the actual effects would be. They tried this, I guess, in Alaska first, and the results, at least in the first election, were less than ideal. But that's not enough data for me to really say one way or another. I think that there's a danger in presuming we get out of this mess by changing the current system we have. And it could be that what we're dealing with is far more psychological or human nature than the best system. I have no problem with making adjustments to the system. Clearly, we could be better off. Something as simple as getting rid of cameras in the halls of Congress, who knows, could improve a lot of things, because then they can't get their little sound bites in and they have to have boring conversations with each other. I do wonder if and I'm getting this from Yuval Levin, you talk about institutions. I think you're absolutely right. I don't know if the toothpaste is out of the tube, but it's certainly, it probably is. I don't know if that means you can't put it back in. It's just going to take a long time and a lot of slow effort. Mm-hmm. Yuval Levin, conservative think tank, is one of the brightest minds on the right today, in my opinion. He has this kind of way of talking about it. The problem with institutions is that they have ceased to be formative and now they are performative. That people get elected to Congress, they become heads of businesses, titans of industry, leaders, professors, and universities, so that those institutions can then become a platform for them to display themselves to the rest of us. The reverse way of thinking of that, the older model, is that I become a member of Congress so that it forms me to be able to work through this institution, both to do good, but also to build my character. And I need to submit myself to the institution. If we could reverse that, it's going to take a long time. And I think it's going to require a lot of education. I think it's going to require a lot of patience. But I think we can begin working on that while we're trying to do other things in the meanwhile. And so I'm the reason I'm saying it that way is because I don't look to other governments that say have like a parliamentary system where there truly are third parties and say, aha, they're getting it all right. It's like, well, no, they're electing borderline Nazis at this point. And it's scary sometimes what could be going on there. And I don't think if you go to the average dude in the UK or in Germany, they would say, there's nothing wrong with our system. It produces the exact results we want. I think we're running into, you can't centralize everything. You can't have a red versus blue. You can't have a bipolar world in which we get everything we want or nothing we want. We're going to have to return to federalism. We're going to have to stop looking to politics to solve so many issues. We're going to have to give Congress back power instead of the president or central authority taking so much of it. And I think we're going to have our parties produce candidates that have a little bit more long-term coalitional mindset all of these things are going to take many years and slow incremental steps, but I don't think there's a silver bullet answer, but it is possible.
Yeah, and I think there's a mistake that a lot of people in the reform space make, that if we just get this in place, everything's going to be fine. You're still going to have problems. And I think, to your point, we saw AfD in Germany win 20% of seats in government. So, which is the second largest party now. So
Yeah.
it's obvious that it doesn't solve every problem out there. So, and I also agree with your take, and this is something I've thought, that really experimentation on a state by state level is the way to go. This is how we got the direct election of senators, and this is how women got the right to vote. It was because it was passed in individual states and then eventually gained enough of a groundswell where it became an amendment. And I do think, as much as I talk about Alaska and Maine as two examples of reform working, we also can't say that Alaska and Maine are representative of the remaining 48 states.
Right.
They all function differently. I do want to push a little bit on sort of reversing the trend away from institutions, because I might have a really cynical view over this, but I don't think the majority of the people out there who are voting, who are deciding who gets into office, have the wherewithal to really understand the value of institutions. And very often it's a binary. I mean, the reason we went from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump was because there were enough people who didn't feel things were working for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think people get the bulk of their information or the bulk of their worldview from entertainment now. They get it on their phones, and they get it obviously on TV to a lesser extent. And I almost feel like the most sensational folks, the most sensational voices are always going to get the attention. And in a lot of ways, and this might be a cultural thing, but for better or for worse, people right now are gravitating to those more polemic voices. There's something about them that really attracts people, or at least attracts the type of people who ultimately decide elections. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I am open to the possibility that you're absolutely right. I hope you're absolutely wrong. And I say that because I don't know that there is an alternative conducive to ordered liberty. As I said once, by the time you get to calling these things like church and government and state institutions, you've almost sort of seeded the game, because nobody has fine feelings to institutions. You have to identify these things and the groups and the functions of what they are. I think there is perhaps a little bit more resiliency or the potential for reform than your understandable pessimistic, cynical view. Looking around, obviously, and I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think humans innately have value within institutions, and the role is not so much to convince everybody who doesn't have enough time, hardly to do their own life, let alone read books about the value of institutions. It's almost more, if there were more models out there of individuals behaving in ways that, actually Yuval Levin put it this way: the institution that has the most respect currently is the United States military. Part of the reason, one of the things you can say about it, the military, is we know this. Someone goes into the military and they come out a different person. It forms them into something. You can take individuals who are kind of high school dropouts and kind of on the wrong path, and they come out heroes in a sense. Doesn't do that to everybody, but it has this very formative effect. And so I'm a little hopeful that, demonstrated correctly, it pings something in the human heart and spirit of recognizing, wait a minute, they're not loud, they're not flashy, but this is actually wholesome. This is of good character. This is something that I can rely upon. I also think there is a limit or an exhausted nature to the degree to which we're going to ping pong back and forth between the loudest voices or those who work outside of this. I think that ordered liberty only works when the soul is ordered and has liberty within it. I think part of what we're seeing in a breakdown of institutions is that individuals themselves have broken families and broken relationships with, say, organized religion. I'm not just whole cloth for organized religion, but I think there's something to be said about I see this in my own generation, millennials, that we are extremely questioning of values that were just taken for granted, cohesive in the past. That's not all bad, by the way. There's a lot of stupid things the older generations did and believed. It's okay to question. But you want to question to eventually land on some sort of answer rather than just have an empty mind the rest of your life. And I think that to the degree we as individuals are not plugged into institutions that imbue our lives with meaning and purpose, it becomes harder to see how we could solve this at a national level.
Yeah. Hold on just a second.
Sure.
I'm gonna tell you something while we're talking here.
Yeah.
Totally non-related to the conversation. There are 4 default settings in society that I think need to be questioned
Mm-hmm.
and need more thought. It's marriage, having kids, buying a house, and getting a dog. Right? 2 of them I did right. 2 of them I did wrong. If I could go back in time and change anything, I wouldn't have bought a house because I'm lousy at home ownership.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have gotten a dog. And so we're going to hear this dog barking at the Terminix guy for like the next 5 minutes. So just bear with me, listener, because this conversation's rolling and I don't want to stop it here. You know, I'll actually throw. I didn't invite you on to get into a real deep philosophical conversation, but I feel like we're here and we're mining some really good spots. So I want to throw this. I want to throw this at you. I think first and foremost, I think what keeps me from calling myself a Democrat, or what keeps me from embracing the term progressive, is I do believe, as you believe, that power is better decentralized. Federalism is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And concentrating power at the federal level can leave room for a lot of bad things to happen. And so I think that, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of what we consider a lack of faith in government or a lack of faith in institutions is more the fact that the institutions we're viewing are so far away. You know, everything we see now is in Washington. We don't see things in Oklahoma or in Massachusetts. We just don't have that focus. And I think at the state level, things are a lot less sensational, they're a lot less sexy, and they're a lot less scary. They feel a lot more in your control because you could theoretically drive there.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person who represents you is, you know, the guy who owns a local movie theater, like my state rep. So I think there is a lot to be said about giving power back to the states. The second part on the cultural sense of things, or on sort of I can't remember exactly how you put it, but safeguarding the soul in a way. Now, I tend to believe people are very predictable. And under the right conditions, people will behave a certain way. And one of the times I always go back to when I'm talking about the current era is the progressive era, because we saw almost identical conditions. We saw massive technological innovation make a small number of people very wealthy and a large number of people less wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
Huge income inequality. There was a big change in society, a move towards the cities, right? And we started to see a lot of the same things we see now. We saw broken homes. We saw addiction. We saw a decline in church attendance. We saw a decline in participation in membership organizations. And it's my belief that a lot of the tribalism we're seeing now and a lot of the disintegration of society is very much driven by the fact that people's basic needs aren't covered. And when your basic needs aren't covered, you automatically start to look for and embrace people and philosophies that are going to make some sense of the world, that are going to make you feel safe or feel like you have somebody fighting for you. And I think the strength Trump has is, as he put it in his own words, the forgotten people, the
Mm-hmm.
people who have really gotten the short end of the stick over the last 30 years of economic development. And so I'm curious on your view. You know, this is a real nature versus nurture conversation here. But in your view, when we look at the state of the country today, and if you don't agree with the way I'm framing it, call me out here. Do you think the idea that people might on their own, or a large enough group of people on their own, be guided by some shared moral compass to make a change is likely? Or do you feel like the system has to provide first? Do you get what I'm saying here?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. And I don't, again, I'll use the word hopeful. I'm hopeful that yes, say that we could rally around some moral framework. You know, there was a sense of it, say, in the 50s when we were fighting against communism, when we put "In God We Trust" on our money, and I think that's when we added "One Nation Under God" on the dollar bill, or I'm sorry, to the Pledge of Allegiance. It didn't say in Jesus Christ. It didn't say a very specific denominational within Christianity, even though it was kind of largely understood that was the God we were talking about. It was a broad consensus, but it was also agreed to, right? And so I think you can have sort of a moral compass that also allows for 1,000 varieties, if you will, out there. Now, it does remain to be seen, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because some of the most decent individuals I know are non-believers. It does remain to be seen to what degree you can have that in an ever secularizing society that may be shorn of its roots, because I personally believe that even though you don't have to be religious to behave in a decent and good manner, there is a sense in which that morality is informed by a religious overtone eventually, and you can only go so many generations before you might run out of gas. So I don't know, honestly. I think the founders were of the belief that self-government was difficult. Adams himself said our Constitution is only designed for a moral and religious people. I think it's completely inadequate for any other. I think he was right, but I also think there were some changes that happened throughout the generations that allowed this to perpetuate a little more. And by the way, your setup to this is, I think, you mentioned you're not Democrat or progressive. I think you have an incurable sense of the conservatives' notion that human nature is a constant to a certain degree. To a certain degree, everybody believes human nature is a constant, but that's the argument we've been having between the left and the right. To what degree, right? How malleable are we humans? Can we actually come up with innovations in morality and government? Or are we pretty much the same stock that exists for the last 1,000 years, and as you put it, under the right circumstances, we'll behave in predictable manners? I tend to think that's more correct. I tend to think there are only certain circumstances in which you can have ordered liberty. I also tend to think that I'm not smart enough to have the sum total knowledge of what all is going on in individual lives to truly know, could we move toward more cohesive morality? We do seem to have a lot of agreed upon morality now. Notions of tolerance, agreed upon morality of anti-animal cruelty, say. There seems to be agreed upon, I don't know if you call it morality or not, but sort of a general notion that we ought to have a society that provides some social safety net. Again, general, cohesive, agreed upon. You can find exceptions to all of these things. And I think you can build some sort of cohesive framework around that you can govern within. But that's very different than a cohesive morality that would say believes in life after death, and that the way we behave in this life could inform that. Or, that Irving Kristol said that was a single greatest change in Western civilization, was when most people stopped thinking so much about what happened in the afterlife and think more about this life. It's not saying it's good or bad. It's just that alone means our systems of government might have to be rethought to kind of keep up with where people are at now. I hope that at least pecks away at an answer to the question. I feel like I may have missed it.
I threw a big one at you, but I just felt like that's where we were headed, and I had to ask. I'm gonna leave you with one last question here. I feel like we've covered a lot, and I honestly, I really wish we had booked more time, because I think we probably could have gone on. So I think we both acknowledge that the current era, it's very tribalized right now. It's very media driven. How does conservatism find a place in all the chatter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depending on how we define conservatism is winning in a lot of places. Conservatism is winning in blue state progressive America, where while they might preach, wanton wokeism, most of them stay married, have families, and raise them in what you would probably look to as sort of a Norman Rockwell kind of structure, if you will. Most individuals don't actually want to tear apart the system. They want to find value and purpose in their life other than political, if you will. I think conservatism is winning in the sense that it though it has really, really bad representatives, there's still a lot of muscle memory as far as trade policy, as far as international relations, as far as some social policy, although that's a little debatable. I think it's winning at local levels. I think it's winning because it's innate to human nature that we always have things we want to preserve, and we always have a sense of, but how do I preserve this not only for myself, but for future generations? That does not mean there aren't enormous forces against it. But I don't think it would be fair to say radicalism in the sense of a true Jacobin, let's reorient all of our society as winning. There were eras in human history that's true. The Bolshevik Revolution, the Jacobin Revolution in France, these things happened. But most individuals, I think, aren't looking for some grand political system to fix everything. I think they're looking to work within the framework we have and are happy with incremental changes. They're just unhappy with our current crop of leadership.
I think that's a great answer and a great way to cap things off. Thank you for the conversation. I genuinely wish we had way more time for this, so we'll just have to do this again.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back anytime, Dan.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, Sean and I have a very small favor to ask. As I say every week, Sean and I started this podcast because we feel the level of political polarization in this country has reached emergency levels. And we also know there are a lot of people out there who feel the way we do and are tired of being caught in the crossfire between Team Red and Team Blue. So if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to rate this episode and review it. That helps us appear higher on search engines, and share it with anyone you feel might like it too. Those two simple things will go a long way to getting this message out to the people who need to hear it. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.